Have you ever noticed how loud life has become? Not just the noise of traffic, conversations, or constant notifications on your phone, but the noise inside your head. The endless stream of thoughts, the replay of old memories, the worry about what tomorrow might bring. It's like standing in the middle of a crowded marketplace where every voice is competing for your attention. And in the middle of that chaos, there's you, longing for just one breath of silence. That silence, that space where the world seems to pause, is where the inner journey begins. It doesn't start with going somewhere far away. It doesn't require a temple on a mountaintop or a sacred retreat hidden deep in the forest. It begins right here where you are. The first step is not moving outward, it's moving inward. Most people spend their entire lives chasing after things: success, relationships, recognition, possessions. And yet, when they finally get what they thought would make them happy, the joy doesn't last. Why? Because the real hunger is not out there. The real hunger is for peace within. You can fill your house with everything money can buy, but if the mind is restless, there will always be something missing. This is why great teachers throughout history have always pointed us back to the same direction, towards silence, energy, closure, and peace. These are not abstract ideas. They are like 4 pillars holding up the roof of a house. Without them, the roof collapses. Without them, the human spirit feels lost. But here's the truth. Embarking on an inner journey takes courage. It's much easier to stay distracted. It's easier to scroll endlessly, to drown in entertainment, to keep busy so that you don't have to face yourself. Yet the cost of avoiding the journey is high. Anxiety, confusion, emptiness, and a life that feels shallow no matter how much you achieve. The necessity of turning inward comes from a simple realization. Everything you seek outside eventually fades. Beauty fades, wealth fades, even health fades. But what you cultivate within, wisdom, clarity, compassion, this is what stays with you. This is what transforms not only how you live, but also how you experience every moment. Imagine walking through a storm. The rain pours down, the wind howls, the thunder shakes the sky. Most people in life are desperately running from one place to another, trying to escape the storm. But there's another way. You can find the calm space within yourself where the storm cannot reach. Then, even as the winds blow and the rain falls, you remain unshaken. That's what the inner journey offers. Not a life free of storms, but a heart that is no longer controlled by them. This journey is not about becoming someone else. It's about remembering who you truly are beneath the noise, beneath the fear, beneath the expectations, beneath the endless roles you play. There is a presence within you that is vast, quiet, and unchanging. You don't have to create it. You don't have to earn it. You simply have to return to it. So why is it so necessary now? Because the modern world is designed to pull you away from yourself. Every advertisement, every headline, every notification is crafted to demand your attention. Your mind is constantly being hijacked. If you don't consciously turn inward, you are constantly being dragged outward. And the more outward you go, the further you drift from the very thing you're truly searching for. To walk the inner path is to reclaim your own mind. To no longer be a prisoner of restlessness, but to discover a freedom that nothing outside can give or take away. It is to awaken to the simple but profound truth. You are more than your thoughts, more than your possessions, more than your circumstances. And here is where the beauty lies. This journey is not only about finding peace for yourself, it also transforms how you show up in the world. A person who has touched silence speaks with clarity. A person who has cultivated energy uplifts others without even trying. A person who has learned closure no longer spreads bitterness. And a person who has found peace becomes a light for everyone around them. The necessity of the inner journey is not just personal, it is collective. When you change within, you change the energy you bring into your family, your relationships, your community. The ripples extend far beyond you. So as we begin, let us pause for a moment. Take a breath. Notice the space between the inhale and the exhale. Notice how, even for a second, the world feels a little softer, a little quieter. That is the doorway. The inner journey is not waiting in some distant place. It's right here in this breath, in this moment, in this awareness. From here, we begin to explore the path, step by step, into silence, into energy, into closure, and into peace. Not as lofty ideals, but as living practices that can transform the way you see and experience life. Because the truth is simple. If you don't go within, you go without. And this journey inward, though challenging, is the most necessary journey of all. There is a kind of silence that most people misunderstand. We think silence is simply the absence of noise, like when the room is quiet or when no one is speaking. But the silence I'm speaking of is much deeper. It's the silence where the mind itself begins to settle. It's the silence that doesn't depend on whether the world outside is calm or chaotic. It's the silence you carry within you, no matter what is happening around you. Think about it. How often do you truly sit in silence? Not with the television in the background, not scrolling through your phone, not filling the space with endless conversations, but simply being still. For most people, it feels uncomfortable. The moment external noise disappears, internal noise grows louder. Thoughts start rushing in. What am I doing with my life? Did I forget something? Why do I feel this way? It's almost as if the silence exposes everything we've been trying to avoid. But here lies the secret. Silence is not your enemy. Silence is your teacher. In silence, the truth begins to reveal itself. It's like a muddy pond. When you keep stirring it, the water stays cloudy. But if you let it rest in stillness, slowly the dirt sinks and the water becomes clear. The mind works the same way. Constant distraction keeps it muddy. Silence allows clarity to rise. And here's the beauty. Silence is always available. You don't need permission. You don't need special equipment. Even in the busiest city, even in the loudest household, you can touch silence. How? By turning your attention inward, by noticing the breath, by listening to the space between sounds, by allowing yourself to just be without constantly needing to react. In silence, you begin to notice something profound. Not every thought deserves your attention. The mind is like a radio that never stops broadcasting. Most of what it says is repetitive, unnecessary, and often negative. But when you sit in silence, you realize you don't have to keep tuning in. You can step back. You can observe. And in that observation, a new kind of freedom begins. Silence is powerful because it teaches you presence. Without silence, you live only on the surface, reacting, rushing, running. With silence, you sink deeper. You notice the subtle things you usually miss. The rhythm of your heart, the way your body carries tension, the emotions hidden beneath the surface. Silence brings awareness, and awareness is the seed of transformation. But make no mistake, silence is not passive. It is not emptiness. It is alive. It is filled with energy. Think of the silence right before a storm when the air feels electric, or the silence of a forest where every leaf, every bird, every breath of wind is alive with presence. That's the silence of the mind when it settles. It becomes a space of energy, of renewal, of strength. Most importantly, silence reconnects you to yourself. In a world that constantly tells you who to be, what to want, and how to live, silence allows you to hear your own voice. The voice that doesn't shout but whispers. The voice that doesn't demand but guides. This is the voice of your intuition, your inner wisdom, and it can only be heard when the noise quiets down. At first, entering silence can feel like entering a dark room. You don't know what's inside, so fear arises. But the longer you stay, the more your eyes adjust, and soon you begin to see. You realize the darkness wasn't empty, it was full of things you had never noticed. The same is true for the silence within you. Stay with it long enough and you'll discover treasures hidden in your own heart. So, what happens when you practice silence daily? You become less reactive. Instead of immediately snapping in anger, you pause. Instead of drowning in worry, you step back. Instead of chasing every thought, you choose which one to follow. Silence creates space between stimulus and response, and in that space you find freedom. This is why great masters have always valued silence, because it is not just a lack of words, it is the foundation for wisdom. Without silence, words lose their depth. Without silence, actions become restless. But with silence, everything you do gains clarity, strength, and meaning. And here's something most people don't realize: silence heals. It lowers stress, restores energy, and brings balance to the nervous system. More than that, it heals the heart. When you sit in silence, emotions you've buried often rise to the surface. At first, this may feel overwhelming, but in silence, those emotions finally have space to be seen, felt, and released. Little by little, you let go of what you've been carrying for years. The power of silence lies in its simplicity. You don't need to master complex techniques. You don't need hours every day. Just a few minutes of true silence, practiced consistently, can transform your life. It's like watering a seed. Over time, it grows into a tree that gives shade, fruit, and strength. And so, silence is not the absence of life. It is the very ground from which life flows. When you discover this, you stop running from silence. You start seeking it. You begin to understand that silence is not empty. It is full of answers. As we move deeper into this journey, you'll see how silence naturally connects to energy, how it clears the way for renewal, and how it guides you into closure and peace. But for now, remember this: silence is not something to fear. Silence is the doorway, and once you step through, the entire landscape of your life begins to change. Imagine for a moment that your life is like a flame. Some days it burns brightly, radiating warmth and inspiration to everyone around you. Other days it flickers, threatened by the wind of worry, fear, and exhaustion. What keeps that flame alive isn't just food, sleep, or routine, it's energy. Your deepest, most vital energy. Energy isn't something abstract. It is the very foundation of how you think, how you feel, and how you act. Every thought you entertain, every word you speak, and every action you take either replenishes your energy or quietly drains it. And here is the truth: most of us are losing energy without even noticing. Think about how often you say yes when your heart is begging you to say no. How many hours you scroll endlessly through your phone, not because it nourishes you, but because you're avoiding silence. How many conversations you walk away from, feeling lighter or heavier. These small, invisible choices shape your energy more than any major life event. When you learn to manage and nurture this energy, something extraordinary happens. You stop running on empty. You begin to glow with a quiet strength. You radiate a presence that calms others, not because you're trying, but because you are aligned within. So how do we do this? The first step is awareness. Ask yourself, who or what gives me energy? Who or what drains me? It may not be the answer you expect. Sometimes the loudest friend in the room leaves you exhausted, while the quiet walk alone fills you with clarity. Sometimes the task you dread, cleaning your home, finishing that project, gives you more energy than avoiding it ever did, because completion itself is fuel. The second step is boundaries. Energy is precious. Would you leave your front door open for anyone to walk in and take what they like? Then why do we leave our minds unguarded, letting in every complaint, every piece of gossip, every demand that doesn't belong to us? Boundaries are not walls to shut the world out. They are gates, carefully opened for what supports your growth and gently closed for what weakens you. The third step is nurturing. Energy, like a garden, must be cultivated. Meditation, mindful breathing, even something as simple as drinking water with full awareness, all of these nourish your inner flame. Gratitude multiplies energy. Resentment leaks it away. And when you move your body, not as punishment but as celebration, you create a flow that keeps your energy alive. But here's the secret most people miss. Your energy is not infinite. Every day you wake up with a certain amount, and how you spend it decides the quality of your life. You can waste it on arguments, chasing approval, or reliving the past, or you can invest it in love, creativity, and presence. It's not about doing more, it's about choosing better. Think of monks in a Zen monastery. They rise early, they walk slowly, they eat mindfully. To an outsider, their lives may look uneventful. Yet within they are deeply alive because they do not scatter their energy. They know that when the mind is calm, energy gathers. And when energy gathers, life becomes clear, strong, and unshakable. So let this truth sink in. You are the keeper of your flame. No one else can protect it for you. If you feel depleted, it is not a sign of weakness. It is a signal calling you back to what matters. Every breath is a chance to reclaim your power, to nurture your flame to rise again. And when your energy is managed well, silence is no longer emptiness, it becomes fullness. Actions are no longer chores, they become offerings. Life is no longer survival, it becomes art. As we move deeper, let's step into a realm that few truly understand, the invisible connections between energy and the hidden forces of the mind. Because once you know how energy flows within you, you'll begin to see how it shapes the world around you in ways you never imagined. There's a hidden weight that many of us carry, one that no one else can see. It's not in your bag, not on your shoulders. It lives quietly in your mind and heart. We call it unfinished business. These are the conversations you never had, the promises you broke to yourself, the dreams you postponed until someday. They don't scream for your attention, but they whisper constantly. They steal your energy in silence. And unless you close them, you will never feel truly free. Think about it. How many nights have you lain awake, replaying words you wished you had said, or imagining how things could have been different if you had acted sooner? Unfinished business is like an open door in your mind. Cold wind keeps blowing in, and no matter how much you try to warm yourself, the chill never leaves. But here's the truth. You don't have to carry it forever. You can close those doors. You can set yourself free. The first step is honesty. Acknowledge what is left undone. Maybe it's forgiving someone who hurt you, not for their sake but for your own peace. Maybe it's finishing that project you started years ago because your heart still remembers. Or maybe it's letting go of something you clung to long after it stopped serving you. The second step is courage. Closing unfinished business is not always about tying everything up in a perfect bow. Sometimes it's simply about saying, "This chapter of my life is over." You may never get the apology you deserve. You may never get the chance to explain, but you can give yourself closure by choosing to stop reliving the story. The third step is action. Write the letter even if you never send it. Pick up the phone if it feels right. Donate the things you've been meaning to give away. Finish the book, paint the canvas, plant the garden. Each small act of completion clears space inside you. When you close what is unfinished, something incredible happens. Energy that was trapped is released. Suddenly, you have more clarity, more lightness, more peace. You stop living in the shadows of what if and start walking in the sunlight of what is. Zen masters often remind us, life is lived only in this moment. If your mind is entangled in yesterday's knots, you cannot fully breathe today's air. To close what is unfinished is not about fixing the past, it is about freeing the present. And here's a powerful thought. Every unfinished business is also a teacher. It shows you where you have resisted truth, where you have delayed growth, where you have clung to illusion. By closing it, you not only reclaim your energy, you reclaim yourself. So let this be your practice. Look gently at your life and ask, what doors am I ready to close? Some will be easy, some will be painful, but each one you close will make you lighter. And when you are lighter, you can walk further, see clearer, love deeper. And as those doors close behind you, a new horizon quietly opens ahead. It is not empty, it is waiting. Waiting for you to step into it with the energy you have reclaimed, the silence you have cultivated, and the courage you are discovering. Because once the weight of the unfinished is gone, life becomes spacious. And in that space, something greater is ready to unfold. When the noise of unfinished business fades, when the clutter of the past begins to fall away, something remarkable emerges. Silence. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of the heart finally finding rest. This is where inner peace begins. Inner peace is not a place you travel to. It is not found in distant mountains or hidden temples. It is a state of being, an unshakable calmness that stays with you even in the middle of chaos. It is the quiet knowing that no matter what storms rise around you, there is a center within you that remains untouched. But here's the truth most people miss. Peace does not come from controlling life. It comes from releasing control. We spend so much of our lives trying to bend the world to our will, making people behave the way we want, arranging circumstances to fit our plans, fighting against reality as if it were an enemy. And yet, every battle leaves us more exhausted, more restless. The paradox is clear. The harder we fight for control, the further peace drifts away. But when we surrender, not in defeat but in trust, peace quietly walks in. Think of a river. If you fight the current, you tire quickly and the water feels like an enemy. But if you relax, if you allow yourself to float, the river carries you. Life is the same. Peace is not found by damming the river. It is found by flowing with it. Now, this doesn't mean passivity. Inner peace is not about doing nothing or ignoring problems. It is about meeting each moment with clarity and calmness instead of fear and resistance. It's the difference between reacting blindly and responding wisely. How do you cultivate this peace? The doorway is awareness. Begin by noticing your inner storms, the racing thoughts, the tightness in your chest, the stories your mind repeats. Don't fight them. Don't judge them. Simply observe. Like clouds passing through the sky, they come and they go. You are not the storm, you are the sky. The second doorway is acceptance. Life will not always give you what you want. People will disappoint you. Plans will fall apart. Aging, sickness, and loss are part of being human. Inner peace comes when you stop saying, "This should not be happening," and instead whisper, "This is here and I will meet it with grace." The third doorway is presence. Peace is never found in the past you regret or the future you fear. It is always here in this breath, in this moment. Right now, nothing is missing. Right now, you are alive. Right now, you are complete. And when peace takes root inside, something extraordinary happens. The world outside changes too. Conflicts soften. Relationships heal. Even challenges feel different because you are different. You carry a stillness that others can feel, like a candle glowing in a dark room. This is why Zen masters say, peace in the world begins with peace in yourself. You cannot offer harmony to others if your own heart is in turmoil. But when you embody peace, you naturally become a refuge for those around you. So breathe deeply. Feel the calm beneath the noise. Trust the river of life. Let go of control and open yourself to the flow. Inner peace is not something you chase. It is something you allow. And once you taste it, even for a moment, you realize this is the freedom you have always been searching for. When inner peace begins to blossom within you, it creates the perfect soil for something deeper to grow, self-awareness. Because peace is not an end, it is the beginning of truly seeing yourself. Self-awareness is like holding up a mirror, not the one that reflects your face, but the one that reflects your mind, your heart, your patterns. It is the courage to look honestly at who you are without masks, without excuses. So many people live their lives on autopilot. They wake up, go through the motions, repeat yesterday's habits and call it living. But without self-awareness, life is not chosen, it is just repeated. True freedom begins the moment you ask yourself, why do I think this way? Why do I act this way? What is driving me beneath the surface? And here is where self-discipline enters the picture. Awareness alone shows you the map, but discipline is what gives you the strength to walk the path. Without discipline, insight fades into wishful thinking. Without awareness, discipline becomes blind effort. Together, they create transformation. Self-discipline is often misunderstood. People think it means forcing yourself into rigidity, denying every pleasure, living like a soldier under constant command. But true discipline is not about punishment. It is about alignment. It's about choosing actions that honor the highest version of yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. Think of it like a musician. A violinist practices scales not because they enjoy repetition, but because they know discipline unlocks freedom, the freedom to create beautiful music. In the same way, when you discipline your mind, your habits, your impulses, you create the freedom to live with clarity and purpose. So how do we practice this? It begins with small, consistent steps. Wake up 5 minutes earlier to breathe before the day begins. Notice when your thoughts spiral into negativity and gently bring them back. Keep the promises you make to yourself, no matter how small. Each act of discipline is like a drop of water. Over time, it carves deep rivers of change. And here's the hidden beauty. Discipline doesn't make life smaller, it makes it larger. Because when you master yourself, you are no longer enslaved by impulse, fear, or distraction. You stop being pulled in 100 directions and start moving with intention. But the key is balance. Self-discipline without compassion becomes harsh. Self-awareness without discipline becomes passive. When the two work together, they create a harmony that shapes both your inner world and your outer life. As the Zen saying goes, the strongest warrior is the one who conquers himself. And this conquest is not about violence. It is about gentleness, patience, and steady commitment to your true path. When you combine self-awareness with self-discipline, you stop running away from yourself. You stop being at war with your own mind. Instead, you become your own ally, your own guide, your own source of strength. And from this place, life opens in ways you never imagined. Because the moment you master yourself, the world outside no longer has power over you. Once you begin to master yourself through awareness and discipline, a deeper truth comes into view. So much of your suffering is not caused by life itself, but by your attachments to it. Attachments are those invisible threads you tie around people, possessions, beliefs, and even versions of yourself. They feel comforting at first, like anchors that keep you steady. But over time, they become chains. Because everything you cling to is destined to change, and when it does, the tighter you hold on, the more you suffer. Think of water in your hands. If you try to grab it, it slips away. But if you simply cup your palms gently, the water stays. Life is the same. The more you grasp, the more it escapes you. The more you allow, the more it flows. Attachments show up in many forms. Maybe it's the need for approval, the constant hunger for others to validate your worth. Maybe it's material possessions, the belief that happiness lives inside the next purchase. Maybe it's relationships, the fear of being alone that makes you hold on even when love has turned into pain. Or perhaps it's your own identity, the fixed idea of who you think you should be, which keeps you from growing into who you truly are. The Buddha taught that attachment is the root of suffering, not because love or desire are wrong, but because clinging creates illusion. You begin to believe, I cannot live without this, I cannot be happy unless I have that. And with every string you tie, your freedom shrinks. Letting go does not mean indifference. It does not mean you stop caring or stop loving or stop dreaming. It means you love without chains. You enjoy without addiction. You hope without despair. To let go is to open your hands, to allow life to come and go, trusting that what is truly meant for you will remain. But how do we practice this? The first step is awareness. Notice what you cling to most fiercely. Ask yourself, if this disappeared tomorrow, how would I feel? Would I collapse or could I continue? The second step is gentle loosening. Start by creating space. Spend time alone to see that your worth is not tied to others. Give away something you once thought you needed. Challenge your own stories about who you are. And the third step is trust. Trust that life provides exactly what is needed in each moment. Trust that endings are not punishments but openings. Trust that when you let go of what is not truly yours, you make room for what is. There's a saying in Zen, let go or be dragged. When you cling, life will still move forward, but it will pull you painfully. When you release, you walk alongside it with grace. Imagine for a moment the lightness of carrying nothing. No heavy baggage from the past, no desperate grip on the future. Just the present, open and unburdened. That is freedom. That is peace. Letting go is not something you do once. It is a lifelong practice. Each day you will find small strings to untie, small weights to release. And with each release, you will feel a little lighter, a little freer, a little closer to the essence of who you truly are. Because in the end, nothing we cling to is permanent. But the freedom we find in letting go, that stays. When you begin to let go of attachments, you also begin to see life with clearer eyes. And in that clarity, one truth shines. Adversity is not your enemy, it is your greatest teacher. Every person carries scars. Some are visible, most are hidden. We've all known loss, disappointment, betrayal, or failure. And often the first instinct is resistance. Why me? Why now? This shouldn't be happening. But adversity doesn't ask for your permission. It arrives uninvited, and it reshapes the landscape of your life. Here lies the secret. Adversity itself is neutral. It is neither good nor bad. It is simply life presenting you with an unpolished stone. What you do with that stone determines whether it becomes a burden you drag forever or a jewel you carry forward. Think of a seed. It cannot grow on the surface. It must be buried in the darkness of the soil, pressed by weight, before it can rise toward the light. Adversity is the soil in which the seed of your strength is planted. Some of the wisest, kindest, and most resilient people you will ever meet are not those who had easy lives, but those who turned their pain into compassion, their failures into wisdom, their hardships into strength. They learned that the fire that burns can also refine. But how do we transform adversity instead of being crushed by it? The first step is perspective. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" ask, "What is this teaching me?" This shift turns you from a victim of life into a student of life. Every hardship carries a lesson: patience, humility, courage, resilience. The second step is acceptance. Fighting against what has already happened only deepens the wound. Acceptance does not mean liking the pain. It means facing reality without denial. Only then can healing begin. The third step is alchemy, the art of transformation. This is where you take the raw material of suffering and shape it into meaning. Journal your experience, share your story, help someone walking the same path. Turn your scars into bridges for others. In doing so, your adversity becomes a gift not just to you but to the world. And finally, remember this: adversity passes. Just as storms come and go, no pain lasts forever. The river of life keeps moving, and what feels unbearable today becomes tomorrow's source of strength. The Buddha once said, "Pain is certain, suffering is optional." Pain is part of life, but suffering is what we create when we resist, when we cling, when we refuse to transform. So, let your hardships shape you, not break you. Let your challenges deepen your compassion, not harden your heart. Let every adversity be the chisel that carves away what is false, revealing the unshakable truth within you. And when you walk through fire and emerge on the other side, lighter, stronger, more awake, you will understand. The adversity you once cursed was the very thing that prepared you for the freedom you were seeking all along. After walking through adversity and discovering its hidden lessons, you may notice something shift inside you. The constant pull of the past begins to loosen, and the anxious chase of the future starts to fade. What remains is the only thing that ever truly exists: the present moment. The present is often overlooked because it feels too simple, too ordinary. We convince ourselves that happiness lies somewhere else, when the job is secured, when the relationship is found, when the pain finally disappears. But every time we postpone joy, we trade what is for what might be. And in doing so, we miss the miracle unfolding right now. The truth is, life only happens here. Not yesterday, not tomorrow, only now. The breath you're taking, the heartbeat in your chest, the sunlight falling through your window, the sound of silence between words. This is where living begins. But returning to the present is not always easy. The mind is like a restless traveler, always wandering back to old regrets or rushing ahead to imagined futures. That's why presence is a practice. One way is through the body. Notice the rhythm of your breath. Feel the ground beneath your feet. Taste your food slowly. Let the ordinary become extraordinary by paying attention. Another way is through gratitude. Pause, even for a moment, and recognize something simple: the warmth of your tea, the voice of a loved one, the chance to begin again today. Gratitude is the anchor that pulls you gently into the now. And perhaps the most powerful way is through acceptance. When you stop resisting what is, the present reveals itself. It may not always be comfortable, but it is always real. And reality, even when difficult, is far gentler than the illusions we create in our minds. Returning to the present is not about ignoring the past or neglecting the future. It's about finding balance. The past is a teacher, the future is a canvas, but the present is the only brush you can hold. And here's the beauty: the more you live in the now, the more life feels alive. A walk becomes an adventure. A conversation becomes a treasure. A breath becomes a blessing. Zen masters often say, when drinking tea, just drink tea. It sounds simple, almost trivial, but within that simplicity lies freedom. Because when you give yourself fully to this moment, you discover that nothing is missing. Right here, right now, you are whole, so take a deep breath. Let go of yesterday, release tomorrow, and return, again and again, to the only place where peace, joy, and truth can ever be found, this present moment. As this journey draws to a close, let us return to the one companion that has been quietly with us all along: silence. Silence is not emptiness. It is not the absence of sound. It is a presence, a stillness that holds everything. Beneath the noise of thoughts, beneath the rushing of the world, silence waits. And when you finally touch it, you realize it has been guiding you all along. Throughout this path, you've discovered the power of inner exploration, the strength found in discipline, the freedom that comes with letting go, the resilience born from adversity, and the joy of living fully in the present. But silence is the thread that ties them all together, because silence is where awareness deepens. It is where peace is born. It is where the noise of the mind softens enough for you to hear the quiet truth of your own heart. In silence, you discover that you are not your fears, not your regrets, not even your successes. You are the stillness behind them, the open space in which they rise and fall. And here is the greatest secret. Silence is not something you visit, it is something you are. When you stop running, stop clinging, stop fighting, silence reveals itself as your natural state. So let this final moment be an invitation. Take a breath. Feel the pause between inhaling and exhaling. That pause, that gentle space, is silence. It asks for nothing, yet it gives you everything. Whenever life overwhelms you, return here. Whenever your heart grows heavy, return here. Whenever you forget who you are, return here. Because in silence, you are not lost, you are home. This is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of living differently, lighter, freer, more awake. Carry silence with you, not as an escape from life, but as the ground upon which all of life unfolds. And as you step forward, remember this. The world does not need more noise, it needs more presence. The world does not need more control, it needs more peace. And every time you connect with silence, you become a source of that peace, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. So listen closely. Do you hear it? Beneath the thoughts, beneath the world's endless voices, there is silence. And within that silence, you are complete. If this message has touched your heart, take a moment to carry this silence with you. And if you feel called to continue walking this path of wisdom together, I invite you to subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here, we share teachings, stories, and reflections to nourish peace, clarity, and compassion in your daily life. By joining this community, you are not just following a channel, you are choosing to cultivate stillness and insight within yourself. So if these words resonated with you, subscribe, leave your reflections in the comments, and share this with someone who may also be seeking peace. May you always return to silence. May you always remember, you are already whole.